Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Stephen Maxwell. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Really looking forward to speaking about all things cricket, but I think there's a few other sports that you're interested in as well. But let's start where we always start. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your work.
No problem, Dan. Well, hopefully we won't go too much down that rabbit hole of cricket because I'm no expert. Um, so my current job, I'm a coach education manager with Cricket Ireland. I'm a multi-sport coach developer across two continents. I'm a head coach for a Gaelic football team, a senior men's team in Ireland. I'm based in Dublin. I've previously worked as a performance analyst, so I tried to add little things to my repertoire to support my coaching. I own a consultancy firm where we supply services to sports teams and coaches and individual athletes. And I suppose the real reason I got the nod today, I'm currently a student on a Master of Applied Sports Coaching in the University of Limerick at the moment.
You're a busy man.
There's some time in my day.
Wow, that's really impressive. Did you play much sport, or was it coaching straight away for you?
I suppose growing up in North County Dublin, I played a multitude of sports. Gaelic football, hurling, soccer, a little bit of rugby, and a little bit of cricket then when we had a bit of good weather when I was younger, but that was seldom seen.
And in terms of Cricket Island, so you're not a coach per se, you're a coach developer at Cricket Island?
That's correct. So my role is to oversee all the coach education within Cricket Ireland. So um, looking after the introduction to coaching. We've got our coaching kids, which is targeted at 5 to 11-year-olds. So anybody wanting to get involved in that, usually parents. And we've got a level 1 and we run a level 2 as well in the country. And we have a team of coach developers. And my job, I suppose, is the administrator. I support all of them. I run CPD for all of the coach developers as well. And I do a little bit of coaching in terms of cricket when I have a little bit of time in my 9 to 5.
Well, let's start at 5 to 11. It's interesting that you've mentioned that age range straight away. Because often, and I suppose we can be a little bit guilty on this on the Sports Psych Show, we talk about coaching in general, and yet coaching, I suppose, requires different skills for different age groups. At that age group of 5 to 11, what do you think is important for a coach? And what might be different for a coach coaching 5 to 11-year-olds as compared to older groups? I just wondered if you had a comment on that at all.
I suppose everybody has their own opinion on it. In terms of Cricket Ireland, what we try to do is instill a love of the game first and foremost. So 5 to 11 years of age, the philosophy is fun, enjoyment, and making sure that coaches are able to supply a safe environment for those children to enjoy the game. We look at fundamental movement skills rather than specific skills. Obviously, we teach them the basics at that age group. We don't go into the key technical elements. Like bowling, for example, is a very technical aspect of the sport. So we kind of stay away from that at that young age. And then obviously, as you move up the ladder, it becomes more specific, more technical and tactical.
That's really interesting because you do read a lot about fundamentals in sport, or what coaches might describe as fundamentals in any sport. I mean, coming from the sport of golf, we think of fundamentals as a grip, a setup, a posture, and I suppose cricket must have its fundamentals. But what I'm hearing you say is you won't necessarily work on those technical fundamentals too much or at all at that age range. It's more the engagement piece than anything else, and then as part of multi-sports offerings, you're giving young people the opportunity to move. It's just a general physical literacy. Am I hearing you right there? It's more physical literacy and engagement.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Like, especially for children 5 to say 8 years of age, if we can instill a love of the
Mm.
game through physical literacy, box ticked, we could have them playing cricket for the rest of their lives, whether it's a hobby, a pastime, etc. When you get to 9 to 11 years of age, obviously the children, obviously there's different physicality or physical elements to it. So it's trying to instill some of the basics in terms of cricket, how to throw a ball, how to catch, how to bat, for example, or holding it in the right way. And in terms of the coaches, we try focus on 3 skills and developing 3 skills for them: how to instruct, how to demonstrate, and the correct way to praise.
I'd be really keen to unpack how to instruct, how to demonstrate, and how to praise, because I think even the most seasoned coach needs to constantly remind themselves of these 3 areas. I just want to dwell a little bit on that engagement piece. I mean, I always talk to coaches about the importance of what I call 3 Ps. If I was to break coaching down, I talk about these 3 Ps of participation, progression, performance. Participation is the engagement piece, progression is the learning piece, and performance is the performance, playing the game, right? And playing, striving, I suppose, competing in the game. But what I'm hearing you say, okay, at Cricket Island from 5 to 11 years old, we're really emphasizing the participation piece, to use my word, the engagement. But what does, I think we can talk about this, it, you know, we can talk about this, but we don't necessarily know what this looks like. So when you talk about engagement at Cricket Island, developing a lifelong passion for the game, as an example, what kind of things do you want to see from your coaches? Is it an attitude? Is it a set of behaviors? Is it a way of going about coaching? What is it they're doing that's striving to set up lifelong participants and lovers of the game?
I suppose, depending on the personality that's there in front of you as a coach, I think it's very important a coach understands that you can have a coaching hat. So you don't have to be your normal everyday self. Some people are very introvert, okay, but then they put on their coaching hat and it's about getting down to the level of the child, getting eye contact with the child, whether that's on your hunkers, on your knees, etc. And then, instead of telling them, facilitating them learning through a game. And that's probably the best way. Like, kids come to play the game. Even my senior men's team come to play the game. So I'm constantly trying to facilitate them learning through games. And I suppose that's what we're trying to get to at that young age and that first introduction to coaching, I suppose.
I think it's fascinating, and we'll cover that learning when we unpack the instruction, the demonstration, and the praise. I love that idea of a coach hat, and I love it for a slightly selfish reason, in as much as I have a technique that I deliver to coaches that I call a coach head. So it's basically saying, you've got your hat, I've got the head, and that coach head is very much aligned with what you're saying there. Is that when you get out your car, when you walk out onto the pitch, the court, the course, whatever environment you're coaching in, that's an opportunity to put your coach head on, to be the person that you need to be. And I've got a question for you here, because I often get fielded this question when I talk to coaches about a coach head. A lot of people might say, oh, but you've got to be your authentic self. So you used introversion as an example there, on the basis that probably in a coaching environment, human beings need to engage with their people, with their players, in an extroverted manner. They probably can't be introverted. But I do get a lot of coaches who say to me, yeah, but hang on, Dan, what about being your authentic self? So when you introduce coaches to this idea of coach hat, do you ever get a bit of pushback there in terms of authenticity and not being authentic?
Pushback, yes, all the time. You get different
Recognize that.
personalities. There might be someone coming in with a chip on their shoulder, as we say. Um, but like, we talk about authentic leadership all the time, especially as we go up the levels in terms of coach education. But I suppose it depends on the group that's in front of you. So if you're coaching a group of children, um, authentic leadership. What if you're a real strict disciplinarian? Are you going to be able to create a relationship with children? They see that at home with their parents at times. They see that in the school environment. Will they come back to your sessions if that's your personality? So we talk to this when we're training our coach developers. They wear different hats. So they might have their coach developer hat when they're in front of coaches. Then they go back to their own club and they put on the coaching hat. Then they have their parents' hat when they're bringing their child home. So I suppose in terms of being authentic, you could still be yourself, but maybe when you have your coaching hat on, your self awareness is heightened because you need to make sure that those children are having a really positive environment. And then as you go up the stages, like myself, I work with a senior men's team. The average age is about 26, and we've 35 guys. I bring my authentic self every session to show that I'm being consistent. The guys know exactly what to expect from me all the time. And my personality is my personality. There's no change. And that helps for long term because I expect to be with those guys for 2 or 3 years. But if you're just there to facilitate a session maybe 2 or 3 times a month, as a parent helping out or etc., you're putting on that coach's hat and you need to be the facilitator of fun, safe, and an enjoyable environment.
It's really interesting that you brought it back to yourself because actually you slightly stole my thunder there. I was about to ask you what your coaching hat is when you coach, whether that's cricket or that's Gaelic football, and just dwelling there because you said that I can allow myself to be my authentic self. That is I am my coaching hat. If you look at that, if you explore and examine that in granular detail, and maybe I'm asking you to lay yourself bare a little bit here, a bit vulnerable. I mean, when you say that, is that 100% the case, or is there times maybe where you get to a session, even as basic as you feel tired, and you've got to put that coaching hat on? So it's less about personality, but it's almost about emotional state at the time. You've got to put your coaching hat on in order to coach effectively. Does your coaching hat, do you have to adjust to get into your coaching hat?
I suppose I do at times. Let's be honest, we all have things that may go on in our personal life or our working life that may affect us as we're going to a coaching session. I think being self-aware is really important. My own research within my master's program is looking at self-care in coaching, and a big key aspect of that is self-awareness. And I suppose when I reflect on my own coaching philosophy, one of the key words is empathy. And I need
Mm.
to have empathy for my players, but at the same time, I need to be empathetic to myself. And I need to understand that when I'm getting out of the car, okay, did I have a disagreement with a work colleague? Am I going to bring that negativity into the session? And I need to be aware of that within myself and say, okay, I need to park that, and I need to be the consistent, authentic leader that these guys see every single week. And that's someone who is honest, energetic, direct, sometimes a little bit sarcastic and cheeky, but that's just my personality. And if I'm being authentic, the guys can see that. But also at the same time, they're also aware when I might be a little bit down or a little bit quieter, and they can read that. But it helps build those relationships. At times, I coach my nieces on a Saturday morning who are under 8, and for me, I need to put on my clown hat, and I'm the most fun, energetic person in the world. And it doesn't matter what's going on in life. You park that at the gate, and you just make sure that they have a really great experience. And that could be literally chasing Stephen around inside the 10 by 10 cage or 20 by cage and having a bit of fun, throwing balls, etc. So I suppose it depends on the environment. It depends on the group that's in front of you as well.
Unpacking some of the things you've said to me there, I think it's really interesting. You're invested in self-care. That this is a part of what you're studying in your master's program. And we had Dr. Colin Cronin, who you probably know, and he spoke about his work in care in sports. And a big part of that, as you've mentioned, I mean, the term I would use is self-compassion. We've spoken a lot on the Sports Psych show about self-compassion, which is, to use your words, having empathy for yourself as a person, as a coach, as much as you do for your players. I think at the heart of all of this, reflecting back what you've said, at the heart of all this is that self-awareness piece, isn't it? As you've said, I really like that. And I love the fact that you immediately jumped on some action words. Those who listen into the Sports Psych show regularly will hear me often talk about action words. I love action words because I think they're great mediators of behavior. Adjectives mediate nouns. You talked about honest, energetic, direct, and maybe I wrote down the word, cheeky / fun, but that is in essence using those action words and unpacking those behaviorally is what my coach head technique is. So I really, really love that. And the other thing I love about what you've said there is that when players notice that you're not being necessarily energetic or cheeky, or maybe not quite as honest and direct, they that can be a relationship builder with them because they notice that, and it might be that they help you in that moment or in those moments. I'd like to hone in on the self-awareness piece, and whether it's talking more about what you're actually doing in your masters there with that, or just what you do with self-awareness on a day-to-day basis. How have you built your self-awareness, whether it's you as a person, you as a coach, your coaching style?
Wow, that's a question. I suppose it's evolved over the years. Like, I'm trying to think back. I was in preparation for the show. I was kind of counting back how long am I coaching. I'm coaching approximately 22 years. Um, have I made mistakes? Yes, loads of mistakes. And in fairness, I'm very honest with every group I work with. The first thing I tell them is I don't have all the answers. I will make mistakes, but this is a partnership. We're in this together. I'm just the coach. My job is to facilitate. So, um, if I'm looking back at me as you know, as an early coach, when I was 16, 17, 18 years of age, I was very technically minded. And that was my sole focus. When I was working with groups, it was all about the technique. And then it evolved, I suppose, into the tactical elements, the physical elements, as I learned and grew. And it wasn't until maybe my early 20s that I started seeing the mental side of the game and how my relationships can affect how players perform, whether that's in training, whether that's in games, and my engagement with them in sessions. So now I'm very focused on the off the field aspects of coaching, how I build relationships with players, how I engage with them in terms of their own lives. And I make sure that although I'm engaging with them, I make sure that they're able to engage and they feel comfortable asking me about mine. And I suppose it comes back to my coaching process. And as part of the Masters, it's a huge element of, I suppose, semester one of the Masters. You look at your own coaching process. And let's be honest, some coaches don't have a process. They might have it in their heads, but it's not written down, it's not formulated, it's not structured. I had mine structured going into the master's program, but Phil Carney within UL is really good at challenging your thoughts. And over the last 2 years, mine has evolved and grown, and it has become far more detailed because of those challenges or those questions that he poses. And I try to be more encompassing into everything that I do around coaching and not just what's on the field. That it's more so about the individual person. And in terms of my role as a coach education manager, person centered coaching is, it's a buzzword at the moment, but we push a lot of our coach education through that person centered approach. And obviously in underage and youth levels, we push the child centered approach. And we're very aware to make sure that coaches understand that if you're going to be coach centered, It's all about you. And do you understand your players cannot buy into a coach centered approach and what that looks like? And we give them examples, whether they're practical or videos, etc. Um, so it kind of, I suppose, it relates back to my own philosophy. Obviously, I mentioned empathy, but also the other two key values for me are courage and appreciation. And appreciation is appreciating what others are doing for me or because I've asked them to do that as my athletes or my players. And then the courage to stick to my own values. Whether I'm right or wrong, I stick to it because it's what I believe in.
You've described a journey that's marked out by this shift. I was going to use the word progression, but I think that's the wrong word to use, or an unfair word to use in the context I'm going to speak to here. There's been a shift from the tech tac physical to the psychosocial. You could use mental, but it sounds like a lot of what you would do would be psychosocial. I'd like to dig into that a little bit. What was the catalyst, though? You've described it, but what was happening that shifted you from tech tac physical to mental psychosocial? Understanding that tech tac physical will still heavily exist in your world, but what was emerging that made you shift your lens of coaching a little bit?
I suppose it was the environment. So as you mentioned at the start of the show, I'm a multi-sports coach. So when I started coaching, my journey was in soccer, and I worked my way up to from introduction all the way up to UEFA B. And my journey brought me across to America when I was 19 years of age, and I worked there as a professional coach for a time. And in the American environment, it's all about telling. We're not coaching, we're telling players what to do, and that's their expectation. And I suppose I enjoyed it for a time. I did a year, but constantly just telling and getting nothing back. And then anytime I asked a question, you look around, you see all these blank faces, and they're like, you can see the words in their head, but it's your job to tell us, coach. And then coming back to Europe and Ireland, and then I suppose back working with Gaelic football teams, working in rugby for a little bit, and seeing the connection between players and coaches, and players asking questions of coaches, and obviously the old school coach maybe not able or being uncomfortable in those type of situations. And then it was kind of a light bulb moment. I need to be able to have conversations with players. It must be and should be two-way. And I suppose like learning is not linear. Like you mentioned the word progression. I guess it is in a way progression, but there's ups and downs, peaks and troughs, etc. As I said, I have made mistakes. I haven't failed because I've learned. Do you know what I mean? They're just mistakes, but that's what learning is. Um, and I suppose it was to change the environment. I suppose from the culture aspect. The Americans are they're fun, they're energetic, they're very athletic, but it's all about a tell me culture, and I just got bored with it, to be honest. And then when I came home, it was much more challenging. I started coaching in men's sport, and then I moved at the time into ladies football. And for some, the outside perception was okay, that's a backward step. But for me, it was a more challenging environment because working with female athletes, they will ask questions of you constantly. And they're asking why. What is the purpose of this? And I think that's the best way to work with athletes. And now I'm working with a men's team now. I purposely put them in situations where they'll ask me questions because I want them to understand the purpose. And I think that's really important. And if players understand why they're doing something, there's more buy-in, there's more value, and you'll get more out of something as well.
Well, I was going to ask you, you describe your coaching as a partnership. You're a facilitator. You're player centered. Let's dwell for a little bit on your Gaelic football coaching. How are you going about your coaching? If I was to come and watch you, What am I seeing? How are you promoting this idea of being player centered? What are you doing? In what way is it a partnership? Can you describe it a little bit for me?
I suppose if I go back to my process, if I'm not early, I'm late. Okay, so I'm never late. And my partner's never happy with that because I'm usually an hour early for training sessions. So the reason I do that is to be able to arrive and switch off. Coaching for me is part of my self care process. I enjoy it. It's a profession, but it's also a hobby and allows me to switch off from everything else. So by arriving early, by getting myself comfortable, by maybe setting up a few cones. When I was younger, there could have been 100 cones and it'd be a colourful map. Nowadays, there might be 3 or 4 cones and a few balls. And it's just getting there, getting set, so that I can greet every player when they arrive. So that's really important for me, that connection piece, whether it's a fist pump, a high five, how are you doing? Or maybe it could end up in a deep conversation because the relationship I've built up with players, I'm with a team since January now, so they're able to have conversations with me, and I understand maybe little things that are going on in their lives. Like right now is exam time, so I'm checking in with players as they arrive, and some of them they don't want to talk, and you can see that it's about reading body language. So you're learning about, you know, the little things, the idiosyncrasies about players as they arrive. And then in my session planning, I always have a purposeful connection with 3 players on every single session. So over the course of a season, I should connect with players 3 or 4 times purposely within a session. So I might meet Dan and I'll say, sit down with him before the session, and 2 others say, listen, this is what I want you to focus on in this session. Irrespective of what's going on, this is your focus. And I want to see how you react. And I'm going to challenge you in front of the players on this. And I want you to be able to show leadership, take ownership of it, and take responsibility. And that allows me to build relationships with players. Some of them, they really don't understand it at first, but then when they're in it, or they'll have seen others do it in previous sessions, they get more buy-in. And they're starting to enjoy it now. We're nearly 6 months in, and they're starting to understand how I work and my processes. So they're always waiting on a question, because I do love a question. And then is there follow up questions? Or I usually have a notebook in my hands. I've one right here in front of me. I have too many of them. So I usually have that in my hand at a game and at training sessions. And if a really good question comes up from the group, I'll write it down because I'm going to win that again. That's a coachable moment. I'm going to keep that one. I suppose that's where I'm at the moment in terms of how I connect.
I love it. It starts early with self care. You're firstly focused after you're getting in early, managing your care for yourself. You then move on to connection with your people, reading the room in terms of who does and who doesn't want to speak. And then I'd like to dig a bit deeper into this purposeful connection. I think that's really interesting. So you're picking 3 players in each and every session that you're going to purposefully connect. And it feels like, I suppose, to put it, I suppose, a little bit more generically or maybe crassly, it sounds like a goal setting process that builds on connection, or is that a little bit too crass?
Um, I don't know is the answer.
It sounds like you're helping them be process focused. There's specific objectives that you're setting them.
Yeah, there's specific. I'm setting specific goals for them, but at the same time, I'm building relationships with them. So when I sit them down before the session, I'm connecting with them on a different level. That it's not just a coach athlete relationship. It might be, listen, how's everything in family life? You know what I mean? How's things
Okay.
going in work?
Okay.
And then I'll have an outcome in mind for them, and then it's something for them to focus on. But it might change based on that conversation. But for the rest of that session, I'm focused purposefully on these 3 individuals. And at times, I'll ask one of my backroom team to focus on a player who I might think is in a bad space at the moment. Can you keep an eye on their body language, how they're reacting with their teammates? It's just checking in with players constantly. And I just try to have those 3 purposeful, I suppose, moments with players in every session. And for me, it's just about building relationships. I'm learning about players constantly, and like
Okay.
in air sport, we have our league that builds for 5 or 6 months, and then championship season is August, September, and that's where you really know. You really have to know what players you can trust and rely on, and I suppose that's where the purposeful impact on players is really important, because I know who I can trust, what teammates are trustworthy by other teammates, I suppose, as well. Because you've really observed. I think um, one coaching tool is using silence, and another one is observing, because it gives you time to analyze. And some coaches really struggle with that because they can't be silent. Whereas through experience, I've become comfortable in those silent moments, because it gives me time to step back, walk around, and just observe interactions between players and the little idiosyncrasies between certain players. That they may not pass until they could be under pressure, whereas other players, as soon as the head is up, that passes on straight away, and you get to know those little ticks between players.
That's interesting. So it sounds like you're using silence as a tool to externalize your focus, to guide your attention onto the outside world, your players specifically, and learn about them. Your coaching silence is a tool to learn about the behaviors and the idiosyncrasies of habits, if you like, of your players.
Yeah, definitely. Like, everybody has tendencies. And for me to get a better understanding of my players, like, we use video analysis all the time, but in certain moments, the camera is focused on the ball, for example. So, what does Dan tend to do in a certain type of situation? So, if I'm using silence, I'm observing, and I'm able to see what Dan does in a certain situation. The ball might be 50, 60 meters away, but if I just sit back, listen, and observe, I'm able to learn more about you, and that could have a direct impact on the team performance. So, how do I support that? If it's a positive moment, if it's a negative moment, how do we turn that into a learning?
I can assure you, you'll be seeing Dan drop the ball plenty of times. That's for sure. You'll become dispossessed. I think it's interesting, and I don't want to feed an answer towards you within this question, but that sounds quite autonomy supportive. It backs up your idea of facilitation, a partnership, a collaboration with the players. Would you say that that's helped you become, therefore, a better observer? That does this approach help you get out of your head into the game to observe better? Do you think a challenge of being this, and let me get this right, there are many forms of instruction, because questions are instructions as well, but I suppose explicit instruction, if we're constantly engaged in explicit instruction, in many respects we could be inside of our heads more and we have more blind spots potentially.
I suppose it comes back to interventions, when to intervene. So when I was a young upcoming coach, I was constantly intervening, and every time I seen a mistake,
Okay.
I was stepping in, because I saw that as a learning moment. Whereas now, through experience, I'm more comfortable stepping out of the game. You mentioned being in the game. I'm more comfortable now stepping outside the game and allowing mistakes to happen. And if players are learning from those mistakes, they're not failing. And I'm very comfortable with that. So I'm now very comfortable and focused on when I'm going to intervene or have an intervention moment with players, that it's very measured. And by stepping back and observing and analysing what's going on and getting the whole picture view, that intervention is much more focused. The question is tighter, if you get me. It's much more measured, and there's more wins that come out of that intervention than rather having stepping in every moment, having conversations, then going again, then stopping because there's a mistake. And players. enjoy that more because they're participating more. There's less conversation. So an intervention, I try to keep under 90 seconds. If it's 60 seconds, yes, because I'm clocking myself because I'm trying to get better constantly.
How are you defining an intervention?
So an intervention, I suppose, for me, it's a coachable moment.
Mm.
So it doesn't have to be a mistake. For me, it's a coachable moment. So that could be a positive or a negative. So if I see something positive that maybe hasn't happened in a while or has happened for the first time, I might intervene and freeze the session, bring everybody in and go, okay, what just happened? Why did that occur? And we look back at the process and not just the outcome. How can we make that happen again? And get the players thinking about the whole picture. Was it the move? Was it someone's movement? Was it how we communicated? And getting them to reflect on what just happened. And if it's a positive, we want it to happen again. So they need to know why it happened.
How are you getting them to reflect on that moment? You've brought these players together. I'm assuming you're talking less, asking questions, bringing players in.
Yes. So I might ask the player who was in possession, what did you see? What made you decide to do what just happened? Talk us through your process. And then getting players to share. And then once they share, well, I was dribbling down the right wing. I seen movement going across the two centre backs, for example. And then someone will step in. Well, when I seen Dan run across the eye line of the two centre backs, I knew there was room in behind the centre backs. So that's why I made that movement. And then we're looking at the whole picture. And now we know why that ball went in behind the centre backs because their observation or their eye line changed. So now everybody understands why it worked. And then the key aspect is the movement, that unselfish run across the eye lines of centre backs. So that's an unselfish run because they're not looking for the ball, but they're a distraction to the opposition player.
Would it be fair to say you're working from a template or a philosophy of you can tell where somebody might be looking, but you can't necessarily tell what somebody's seeing, and so subsequently you're asking the question around that?
Yes, I believe so.
I've done a little bit of work in Gaelic football, and two things struck me. One is the enormity of the pitch, and I was just exhausted just looking at it, let alone running on it, and I didn't do any running on it. And the pace of the game. And you've spoken a little bit to this, but I'm assuming, I mean, how you love to question, but questions take time. And it's an intense game. And I'm assuming you want to mirror the intensity of the game often, perhaps not always, but often. I mean, how do you wrestle with those two dynamics?
For me, it comes back to planning. So when I'm having those interactions with three players before every session, I'm teeing them up. So we're going to go through this game or this drill or this principle in the sessions this evening. This question is going to come. I'm asking you the question now. I want you to start thinking about it. And I might tee them up with a video I use an app called Tactical Pad. So it's able to give players a visual demonstration of what's going to occur in the session. So I've teed a player up so that when we're in that scenario on the pitch, we're not wasting time or we're not losing time because someone, has been teed up, and it shows that I'm able to see what their leadership is like. That even though they've been teed up, are they comfortable stepping in and speaking in front of their teammates? And some players struggle with that, let's be honest, and that's okay. But I'm seeing, can they take on the leadership? Like we have two young guys just turned 18, first year at senior level, and they have no problem telling older players what to do, where to be, etc. But yet we have a 24-year-old who won't say boo, and that's fine because they're very team orientated, but they don't maybe feel comfortable talking or challenging teammates. So when I sat down with him and I gave him that scenario, he didn't feel comfortable, and that's fine. But then post session, I sat down with him and I asked him certain questions to tease out, what would you do in this situation? And again, it's about building those relationships and getting to know your team.
You said when you sat down with that player, just honing in on that player who might be considered a little bit more introverted or perhaps experience a degree of shyness, which would be more in line with the personality trait of neuroticism. You said there that it was uncomfortable for him to express himself or to challenge another player, and you said that's fine. And then you sat down with him afterwards and had another conversation with him. Wouldn't there be value in challenging that player to feedback irrespective of discomfort?
Yes. So when I sit down with the players, I ask them, how can you communicate? If you don't feel comfortable vocally communicating, how can you communicate within the game? So we talk about cues or triggers in terms of hand-eye coordination, for example. So if we want to be really intentional, we'll make eye contact, and it might be, a fist pump, but we're 20 meters away, or open body position. So how can you ask more of that player? Or we use a certain hand signal. I won't give any secrets away, but we use a certain hand signal about the type of pass we want played. So I'm showing him different cues of how to communicate with his players. And in fairness, he's taken that on. He's starting to actually verbally communicate more now as well. He wants more ownership of the ball, which is fantastic. So he's becoming more confident because we've given him alternatives to communicating verbally.
That's really interesting. It's like a scaffold, a teaching scaffold, right? You've scaffolded that by helping him develop a series of non-verbal forms of communication, labeled that as leadership, and subsequently developed his confidence to move that onto verbal communication.
Yeah, very true. I've heard of scaffolding before, but I probably read one research paper on it over the last 2 years. But there's so much going in at the moment. Writing my dissertation, it's not in there. It's probably in the back of the filing cabinet.
It's great coaching, Stephen. Look at it. It's great coaching. You're changing behaviour. Fantastic, and it's interesting that how interrelated. This is what I'm so passionate about when it comes to coaching and psychology and psychosocial and even biopsychosocial factors, but how interrelated these things are. It can start with the what you call purposeful connection with three players, where you're setting specific challenges, you're giving them a heads up about what you're going to get them involved in, and that's leading to good questions on the pitch, but it's also leading to moments of leadership development and probably teamwork as well, alongside the relationship piece. That there really is a relationship between all of these psychosocial factors, enveloping the technical, tactical, physical side is all thrown into the mix, isn't it?
Oh, massively, massively. And, I suppose, let's be honest, players have to be selfish. Do you know what I mean? So the better your relationship with players is, when you come up against those challenging moments, that's when you'll understand that they don't finger point because your relationship is better with them, that they can absorb more challenges because they trust those around them. Whereas if those relationships aren't there and they're not strong, when things are going wrong, everybody's pointing fingers at each other. So that's I can't underestimate how important it is building relationships. And it's the same with your coaching team. Do you know what I mean? That they're not going to challenge you in front of others because they believe and trust in the process.
We've spoken quite a bit about the engagement piece here. We've branched into learning, and those are interrelated, as we've said. We actually haven't spoken about, or you haven't shared with us at what level of Gaelic football this is, but I'm assuming performance plays a big part. You did say there's a season and there's a season finale. So recipes for engagement, recipes for learning, but a framework or recipe for performance, for competing. What's going on in your coaching brain when it comes to competing? How are you helping players do that?
It's really interesting. I ran a workshop or an intervention at the weekend with a group of academy coaches who I'm doing my research with,
Mm,
and they asked me in terms of planning. It was kind of it. We went off on a tangent, as great discussions do, and they asked me in terms of my planning, how do I plan for a season? And for me, I look at the end and I work backwards. So my planning encompasses the whole season. And that way, then I can stick to a process. Everybody knows the structure and the road or the journey we're going to go on, and we understand that there's going to be challenges on it, and the process might evolve, it might change. But when it changes in a set in terms of session planning, it's only 10 or 15 minutes of a session will change because we have structure. And if we I call it performance factors. So when I put in those four things, technical, tactical, mental and physical all together, we call them performance factors. So we know exactly when and where we're going to focus on those performance factors, and then through analysis we make those tweaks to sessions over 10 or 15 minutes. And then obviously I bring in the experience and the knowledge of a strength and conditioning coach. I allow them and I give them the autonomy to plan us the season as well, and we make sure that we give equal amounts of time for everybody, because it's a team. There is a team within the team. We're usually standing on the sideline. I try to keep them as quiet as possible. That's not always the way it can be. But then we bring in the sports psychologist, and I suppose there's a culture in Irish sport, and I'm not sure you might come across it elsewhere as well. Sports psychologists are usually brought in towards the end of a season, and it's usually for crunch time and it's one session. Whereas I think mental training is just as important as physical training or tactical training. It should be a process done over the course of a whole season. So we make sure that's built into every single session we do, that the mental or the psychosocial plays an aspect in every single session we do.
may I ask what that looks like, and feel free to share what you can share and feel is appropriate to share.
Yeah, I suppose as a coach developer, I suppose I'm getting more comfortable with sharing absolutely everything I do. Because if I do that, then that means I have to get better because I've given away everything I have.
Yeah, there is that
Um,
logic.
Now, in terms of maybe systems of play or game plan, that's not going to happen. But the principles behind it and the structure, yes. Um, so like really simple things like
Mm,
I play X's and O's with bibs. Trying to get players to think.
mm,
Without a ball. I use tennis balls. We juggle before a game to build their focus. There's one I only use with the adults, so instead of a football, we'll bring in a medicine ball and we do a simple passing drill with a medicine ball. And obviously, it's 10 kg we use, so there's a bit of weight, so there's much more focus goes into delivering that pass. And then we'll swap that out and we bring in a golf ball. Again,
yeah.
there's much more focus, but it's a different size. And I don't know the exact science behind it, but for me, it allows players
Mm,
to get focused and comfortable really, really quick so that we can get more benefit out of a session. And it means our sessions are more focused, they're
mhm.
shorter, which players love as well, so they've more free time. Um, so they're just little things we try. You could probably tell me the science behind that. We try to make sure that both sides of the body are engaged at all times as well. Bilateral movement, I suppose, is really important in Gaelic football nowadays, and they're the players that stand out. And obviously, working both sides of the brain. At times, I have two whiteboards, probably a one size that I bring out on the field, and we might have a game on the board, and I get them to draw, and it completely gets players out of their own mindset. And puts them in really uncomfortable situations. But again, it's all about mental training. It's not just the physical parts of the game.
Are there any? I love everything that you're saying. Are there any behavioral keys or even specific forms of messaging that you're repeating in activities in sessions that might align themselves with the mental side? behaviors that you're asking players to execute no matter what, almost in servitude of resilience.
Yeah, I suppose some people hate abbreviations and they think it's real Americanized, but there's one I really love and it's Jeff. So it's judge effort first, and it's something that I use in everything I do. I make sure it's at the forefront of everything we do in terms of coach education. And in terms of my team, from the very first session to the very last one, we bring the parents in as well, even the adults. Judge the effort. Judge what your sons and daughters are doing before you look at the outcome of what happened in a movement. And we talk about that in every single training session. I think that's really important because an awful lot of the world nowadays, people just focus on outcomes. But what about the process that's gone into that? Um, it could have been an example I even gave it Saturday morning. Um, Dan beats whether it's basketball, he dribbles around four different players. Okay, he's carried the ball from one half to the other, and then he throws the ball for a 3-point basket and he misses. Okay, and all the audience in the crowd are focused on the miss, and there's a new one, and then they go, "What are you doing?" Do you know what I mean? There's a manager on the sideline. What are you doing? That's crazy. But for me, it's look at the process. Look what he's done to get there. Look at the positives. Okay, if we're going to sit down in a post session, okay, Dan, what would you do differently? And I talk about this in terms of Gaelic football. If I'm going to carry possession for a long period of time, which could be only seconds, but if I'm beating players, there's physical elements because it's a contact sport. I don't want that player to take the shot because they've made physical contact. There's a little bit of drain on the body or they're off balance. So the decision to make for them is I've done the hard work. Can I be unselfish and give this to someone in a better position? And that's about the players judging the effort first, that I've gone through the hard process. I'm not ready to take this shot, and they give it off.
It's really interesting because as you're speaking there, it's making me think of how often, but not always, I'll try to help, whether it's coaches or players, differentiate between performance outcome and performance process. If we're trying to pass the ball, there's a performance outcome to that. I've either completed the pass or I haven't. But then it's an examination of that performance process. Like I might not complete the pass, but the performance process might be awesome. I might have got that technically spot on. I might have, to speak to your thing there of effort. The effort was there. It was a positive execution of the action. The performance outcome didn't quite happen. And that's speaks to the complexity of analyzing performance, doesn't it, in many respects? I mean, you can go further. You can say there's an outcome from the perspective of the game result or the game score. Performance could be split into two: performance outcome, performance process, as I've just mentioned. And you could split those. Certainly you could split the performance process into effort and technique, and maybe even tactics as well. And then you've probably further got the mindset piece around what you might describe as concentration and confidence and commitment and control. So it's, I suppose this is almost a neat segue on where I want to close this conversation, which is reflection. But yeah, the performance piece is quite complex when you break it down.
It is. It really is. Like one thing we try to do with our coach developers, who are then going to pass the message down to coaches, is that outcomes are important as well in terms of the technical aspect. So if we go back to cricket, how a child bowls the ball, if the outcome is correct, but we look at their body and they're off balance, etc. If they're getting the right outcome in terms of how they bowl, the speed they're bowling, the spin they might put on it, why would we change their body position?
Mm.
You know what I mean? If you look at golfers and golf coaches, and I've read a few research papers, you might meet a golf coach where Dan comes in to Stephen, the golf coach, and we look at Tiger Woods, and I go, right, I want you to shoot and swing just like Tiger Woods, but your physical appearance and your spine may not be able to bend like that. So we need to look at outcomes. Are you getting the right outcome in terms of your swing? And I think that's really important. So we're judging the effort that goes into the technical elements. And if your outcome is correct, why, as coaches, would we change that? I think that's really important from a coaching perspective.
Well, having a golfing background, I know plenty of examples of this kind of scenario. I mean, one of the most overt one over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years was the development of Jim Furyk. Do you remember Jim Furyk, the American golfer who there's a popular sort of saying in golf for golfers who have abnormal looking swings or aesthetics that look a little bit different, and that's an octopus falling out of a tree. You look like an octopus falling out of a tree, and I suppose you could argue that's a little bit of what Jim Furyk looks like. Although if you analyse his downswing, it's so on plane, it's outstanding. And I've actually walked around with him in a practice round when I did a few weeks on the US tour working, and he was and is phenomenal. But his coach was his father, and his father would just watch the ball flight. He would watch the ball flight. He would obviously watch technique, but he wouldn't overly judge it. And he would just watch the ball flight and base things on the consistency of the outcome. And he noticed that, okay, my son has a slightly idiosyncratic looking setup, a slightly idiosyncratic looking backswing, but the outcomes are consistent. And it's it does take bravery, though, Stephen. I do sometimes, I listen to so many podcasts talking about this stuff, and I suppose this is the skill acquisition piece, which sports psychology is heavily involved in. Speaking to what you've spoken about and the story I'm relating, but it does take bravery for a coach to look at a very idiosyncratic motion and not strive to change it. And I know there's all kinds of different theories and philosophies that underpin that, whether, talk about ecological dynamics and constraints-led approach and their belief that, around letting technique emerge through the task and its interaction with the environment and degrees of freedom and academic terms like that. But ultimately, if you're a coach, it takes bravery not to change an action that looks a little bit different.
Completely agree with you. Coaches need to become comfortable being uncomfortable, and it's something that's really hard to do. It's like being silent. Some coaches really struggle with that, and then at the end of the day, we talk about this in terms of our coach developers. The job of the coach is to become redundant. You share and give everything you can to support a player to get in through a comfortable process that they're getting consistent outcomes, and if they're getting consistent outcomes, then we become redundant and our job is done.
A final part of our conversation here, reflection. You talked earlier about the importance of self-awareness. Self-reflection, team reflection. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, whether it's reflecting as a coach with players, or players reflecting on their game. What's your thoughts? What conversations have you been having recently with coaches and or players around reflection?
I suppose the first thing to say from a coach education point of view, across all sports, we do not do enough for coaches in terms of supporting them in how to reflect. I think that's something that we need to get better at across sports. It's something we're developing at the moment in cricket. No pressure on me at all. But in terms of how I reflect as an individual, I use different processes. Like, as I said, I have my notebook with me at all times. I'll write notes consistently in training, before, during, after. I actually wear a microphone during all my training sessions, so my players probably don't know this, but they'll know if they listen to this. I wear it all the time, and I record everything I do. And then driving home in the car, I'll listen back and go, okay, why did I say that? It wasn't in my plan. Why did I deviate from that conversation? And then it also picks up the conversations I'm having with players, so I'm able to keep that fresh in my mindset that Dan said this in that moment, and that's a really good learning. I'll make sure to bring that forward. So that's two ways I suppose I reflect, and obviously through the master's program I've done in UL, that I hope to finish in August. We've learned different ways and different frameworks to reflect. Like there's Rolf, is it what? So what? Now what?
Yeah.
And there's different kind of frameworks in terms of how to reflect. And I tried to share this with our coach developers and coaches. And I suppose one way we reflect with our current team, and also how we reflect with our coach developers when we run a program. We sit down post program, immediately post program. We always say it's in the plan. There's 15 minutes at the end where we sit down. Okay, what could we have done differently? What went well? And
Okay.
usually we follow the framework stop, start, continue. So what do we need to stop doing? We keep it really simple because it's only 15 minutes. We're after working 9 to 6 for 2 days in a row on a weekend, and we make it really, really simple. And it's just a quick reflection. And then obviously we'll jump on a Teams call because we're from all four corners of the country. And we'll jump on a Teams call and really dig into that detail then in a week or two where we've all had time to assimilate what was said. Um, Another way we also have started reflecting in the last 12 months from a coach educator point of view, we record feedback. So if I'm giving feedback to a coach or a participant, that's recorded through either just a mic or video recorded to see basically to standardize feedback. So as you mentioned at the start, some people give feedback or talk about themselves for 5 seconds and some talk about for 15 minutes. We're trying to bring that closer together, that when we're giving feedback to coaches, it's 10 minutes rather than 5 minutes or 15 minutes, that everybody's getting the same process, the same value in terms of feedback, which I think is really important if we're going to continue and grow coach education.
Well, there's so much great stuff there. And just a final quick question from me, just checking for my understanding. You mentioned sort of speaking into a microphone or recording your thoughts during training. Is that overtly the Think Aloud protocol? Dr. Amy Whitehead has been on the show a few times to talk about the Think Aloud protocol. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, I believe so. We did read through one of the papers of Amy's while on the course.
Yeah.
I actually started recording before I was on the master program, and I suppose through the check and challenges with Phil and Ian on the program, I suppose consolidated that I should be doing this
Yes.
consistently, and that it's not just what Stephen does. It's best practice.
Well, for those listening in who might be interested in the Think Aloud protocol, it's episode 104 with Dr. Amy Whitehead, which is really, really worth listening to. Stephen, that's flown by. What a fascinating hour that's been. That's absolutely awesome. I can't thank you enough. Really interesting. We've covered so many different topics there. And I know you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. I'm not too sure how much of a social media user you are, but how can people find you and potentially follow you?
I try to be consistent in everything I do, so all my handles are Stephen Max 2404. So everybody now knows when my birthday is as well, so you know where to send when and where to send the presents.
Fair enough. So I assume that's an X account, that's an Insta account. You've got the whole
That's
range.
it. Or
Okay,
LinkedIn for
brilliant.
my professional network as well.
Perfect. Perfect. Stephen, thank you so much for today.
Dan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.